Hello and welcome back. This week we're going to concentrate on another kind of war. Uh, as we've talked about since the start of this course, the surveillance state tends to ratchet up during wartime, whether it's the war on terrorism or the American Revolution or the Civil War. Today we're going to take a large leap in time to the First World War. We're going to discuss World War I as a total war. So keep that term in mind. We're going to define that and discuss what that means. And in the context of World War I as a total war, we will begin to understand how and why the surveillance state expanded during this particular war. What this means in brief, before we get to a more detailed discussion later on, this is a war that required a massive commitment, one not seen since the Civil War. As a total war, the World War brought a significant expansion of the surveillance state. It entailed the monitoring of immigrants, radicals, suspected dissidents. Complete loyalty to the cause of the war was demanded. And that's difficult to achieve in a nation whose constitution has an amendment. As we saw, the First Amendment protects free speech, free press, the right to assemble, the right to petition. What will be the fate of these individual rights, these civil liberties, in the context of World War I? That's something we will see. We'll also see how the government and law enforcement kept tabs on Americans in the effort to successfully wage a war on a scale not seen before. World War I was an unpopular war, So this was a challenge for the federal government, for law enforcement, to ensure Americans' commitment and loyalty to the cause. So new laws, new initiatives were required to try to successfully wage this war and get as many Americans as possible on board. And you see right there on the title side, there are a group of protesters. They're standing outside the White House protesting a set of laws called the Espionage and Sedition Acts that we will talk about later and will also come up in your discussion. Before we get to the war, though, since we are taking this leap in time between the Civil War, which ended in 1865, and World War I, which began in 1914, I just want to fill in the blanks a little bit and discuss some developments in the surveillance state surrounding the First World War. Just to place it in a bit of context, to show that even when the country is not at war, the surveillance state doesn't disappear. First, let's take a quick look at what I'm calling the new moral surveillance. We discussed back in week 2 the steps American colonists took to maintain order in their towns and colonies. And as you discussed, they had a number of motives. One was simply the survival of their colonies, but also they were deeply religious, especially the Puritans, and that was reflected in their laws. Well, even in the 1800s, 1900s, and maybe even today, Christian, especially Protestant morality, continued to be a powerful force shaping American politics, society, and culture. One of the leading figures in this new moral surveillance is the man pictured there on the slide. He is Anthony Comstock, a self-appointed reformer. In 1873, he founded a group called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. There you see their seal there on the slide. This group sought to tighten vice laws and punish purveyors of obscenity. So the way they defined obscenity was much stricter than we may today. As you see, Comstock called himself a weeder in God's garden. And he saw it to be his job to cull out the weeds in God's garden. In this case, excuse me, in this case, weeding out immorality. So he founded this group, the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, in 1873. Later that year, this group successfully pushed for, they passed the Comstock Law. That wasn't the official name, but the nickname of the law after Anthony Comstock. As you see, the Comstock Law criminalized the usage of the Postal Service to send so-called obscene materials. That included pornography, which could even mean descriptions of sex, not just pictures, contraceptives, substances that are meant to induce abortions, even personal love letters between lovers, between husbands and wives can be considered inappropriate, obscene, and the person sending them could be punished. Comstock himself became a postal inspector and would boast that he was responsible for destroying some 15 tons of books captured in his net. And among those books were actually anatomy textbooks, textbooks meant to teach students about the human body. Some of those were considered obscene and were destroyed, and those sending them punished. In addition to 15 tons of books being destroyed, some 4 million pictures were destroyed. Comstock also boasted that he was responsible for some 4,000 arrests under this law, which continued even after his death. The law was still in effect. And he claimed to have driven some 15 persons to suicide, people who were so ashamed of being caught and punished under these laws. So clearly the monitoring of Americans to enforce moral standards did not end in the colonial era. So we also see this in the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1919. This was a push. There had been a many decades long effort to ban the production and sale of alcohol, and it reached fruition in 1919 with the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was pushed mainly by a lobbying group called the Anti-Saloon League, a group of men and women who were campaigning against the evils of alcohol. If you take a look at this cartoon on the slide, it kind of sums up the arguments against alcohol. You see these kegs of booze marching through the streets, kegs and bottles of booze marching through the streets. If you look at the sky behind them, what are they leaving in their wake? They're leaving waste and ruin. Let's read some of their signs that the kegs of booze are carrying. We make people poor. We cause poverty and crime. We are against progress. We rob women and children. Many women were at the forefront of this prohibition movement because in many cases they were victims of neglectful men, abusive husbands. We fill penitentiaries and asylums. We waste grain. I also want to call your attention to another sign that the booze is carrying. You see at the front of the line, there's a sign that reads Hun Rule Association. Hun was a slur for Germans. And actually World War I helped push prohibition past the finish line, because advocates for prohibition tried to make the case that German brewers and many producers of beer were German. They tried to make the case that German brewers were trying to undermine American productivity in wartime. And so you see here they're arguing that booze is the product of the Huns, meant to weaken Americans. So indeed, America was voted dry in 1919. Constitutional amendment was added. That means that both houses of Congress had to approve it, and then the states had to ratify it. Of course, as I'm sure you know, this was a failed experiment and a disaster. It led to a black market, massive corruption at the federal level, and also opened the door to organized crime. People like Al Capone, perhaps the most famous among them. And this experiment would end in 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment, which undoes prohibition as federal policy. So this is another example of a moral crusade, expanding the surveillance state. So the Treasury Department, the U.S. Treasury Department, was in charge of enforcing these laws and would have to monitor people, keep an eye on what they may be drinking. Another development that spurred the surveillance state to action was the outbreak of disease. So if we could create a larger category, it seems that the surveillance state expands in times of crisis, wartime, what some consider moral crisis, and also epidemics. Immigrants in particular, but other Americans as well, were closely monitored or quarantined, meaning isolated, separated, and kept under the watchful eye of public health officials, and in some cases even law enforcement. An outbreak of the deadly disease cholera in 1892 saw a significant expansion of New York's Public Health Board to combat this public health disaster. Most notoriously, during the time we're talking about, we see in the former Confederate states, those states that lost the Civil War, the ones they had seceded, broken off in order to protect slavery and maintain the racial hierarchy, but they lost that war. But after the war, they tried to recreate, in some ways, slavery, but in a different guise. We call that the Jim Crow South. Jim Crow was a character in minstrel shows. These were popular variety shows with song and dance and skits and puppet shows, etc. There's this kind of stereotypical buffoonish slave character named Jim Crow, and that came to be used to describe a system of apartheid in the South. It was essentially a police state of whites monitoring and brutalizing African Americans. Of course, people were separated by race on train cars and schools and movie theaters, restaurants, buses. And also, African Americans were deprived of any political power, deprived of their most basic right, the right to vote, through poll taxes, through grandfather clauses. Some states passed grandfather clauses, meaning that if their grandfather was ineligible to vote, then they cannot vote. And of course, many of them had grandparents who were slaves, meaning they couldn't vote. And also literacy tests, which weren't really tests of literacy, but rather just another obstacle to prevent African Americans from voting. In 1940, only 3% of all African Americans in the South had registered to vote successfully. What does this have to do with the surveillance state? Because what we have here is not just law enforcement enforcing segregation and the suppression of voting rights, but also vigilantism, informal law enforcement by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, but also just people not affiliated with any group who would organize and punish African Americans who stepped out of line in the view of the dominant white population. And so what you see here, year by year, the number of lynchings in the United States. Now, we would call this murder, but this was a widely accepted practice in the West and in the South. As you see here, here's a photograph. This lynching that you see in the photograph is actually from the 1930s. The dates I have here only go up to 1901, but that doesn't mean lynching stopped then. So African Americans were watched closely by their landlords, by their employers, who were often the same person, by law enforcement, even by regular Joes on the street, making sure that black people were quote-unquote behaving. They knew their place as subservient to the white population. So sort of like the slave system by another name. So all of these examples, before we're going to talk about World War I in a second, all of these are examples of the surveillance state at work and during the time between the Civil War and the First World War. Different reasons, different motives. One was to try to enforce a kind of moral purity on Americans. In other cases, in cases of epidemics, public health scares, an effort to ensure the public health. And then also we see in the South an effort to oppress African Americans and prop up whites. Each of these, of course, especially the last category, are prone to abuse. The last category, of course, is a system of racial violence and terrorism. Even when trying to protect people from disease, which of course is a noble endeavor, oftentimes immigrants were scapegoated as purveyors of disease, when in many cases, when they did get sick because their living conditions were so awful, not because they were somehow biologically tainted. And as well, in these efforts to enforce a kind of morality, people of different religions could be targeted. Catholics, Jews, and others may be targeted. And women as well. There were higher standards for female propriety than there were for men. So all of these are efforts to Americans monitoring other Americans, sometimes in official capacity, sometimes in more informal capacities. Now, the surveillance state would only ratchet up once World War I comes along. So let's quickly talk about what led to the First World War. We'll see what got America involved in it, which America was initially resistant, and then we'll talk about the nature of the war and the state of the surveillance state within it. So prior to World War I, which as I said earlier, began in 1914, many describe Europe as a kind of powder keg ready to explode. There's an intense competition between nations and massive buildups in military might, large armies and navies being developed, weapons being produced. It almost seemed as if many nations had their itchy trigger fingers on the trigger. Furthermore, within and between nations, there's quite a bit of ethnic tension. And this was a time of intense racism in Europe, where people of a nation would assume their own superiority. British assumed they're superior to the Spanish and to the French assuming they're superior to the Germans thinking they're superior to the Russians, and so on. And they would couch superiority in terms of race and nationalism, a race-based nationalism. And so it's a very tense time. And it would take one spark to set the continent on the course toward war. In the summer of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, pictured there on the slide, were visiting the city of Sarajevo in a state called Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, who were Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie? Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of the empire called Austria-Hungary. He was the grandnephew of the emperor at the time. When that emperor dies, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was next in line. So he was a big deal. So back in 1908, Austria-Hungary annexes the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which angers a lot of people in the region, Eastern Southern Europe. And so in June 1914, the Archduke and his wife are visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, this state which had recently been annexed, made a part of Austria-Hungary. Well, there's an attempt on the Archduke's wife, June 28, 1914. Someone throws an explosive, it's batted away. Some people are injured. The Archduke and his wife, they visit some people in the hospital who are injured, and on their way out of the city, the driver gets lost. They stumble upon another assassin who shoots the Archduke through his throat, shoots Sophie, and both die. So the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary has been assassinated. The assassin was a member of a group called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was a group from a nation called Serbia. It was a nationalist group. And this group was upset with Austria-Hungary for annexing Bosnia-Herzegovina and also muscling in on the territory surrounding Serbia. And so this was kind of meant, this assassination was meant to intimidate Austria-Hungary and to say, butt out of our affairs. Of course, it did not work that way at all. Austria-Hungary was committed to teaching Serbia a lesson. And soon, Austria-Hungary and its allies would be at war. Serbia had an ally too in Russia, and Russia had friends as well. And mass mobilization would ensue on the way to World War I. So this is the way the sides broke down. War breaks out in the summer of 1914. So on the right side of your screen, you see the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary, of course, is part of it. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Austria-Hungary had a very powerful ally in Germany. Germany at this time was the most industrialized European nation, the wealthiest European nation, and had the strongest military. So Austria-Hungary probably would not have been as aggressive as it was without the backing of Germany, but it had it. It also had support from the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, which joined the war the year after it began, joined the war in 1915. And just to clarify, some of you may not know this, but the Ottoman Empire no longer exists. It would be broken up after World War I. And then on the other side, you have the Allies. As I mentioned, you see Russia on that list. Russia gets involved because Serbia was a close ally of the Russians, and so Russia intervenes to defend Serbia from Austria-Hungary and Germany. But Germany's war plans included a two-front war, an invasion of Russia and an invasion of France. So France is like, hey, wait a second, we're not at war yet. Germany says, well, tough, we are now. So France is at war with Germany. Great Britain is an ally of France and Russia, and also eager to weaken Germany, the most powerful European state at the time. Japan would join the effort later in 1914. Italy would join on the side of the Allies in 1915, and the US would join on the side of the Allies in 1917. So as you see, much later, war begins in 1914. US doesn't enter the fray until 1917. Let's talk about the US entry into the war, and this will help us better understand the way the surveillance state develops in the US during wartime. So the US initially was neutral. American President Woodrow Wilson declared American neutrality initially. And sentiment within the United States was very much divided about this war. This was in part because the United States was and is a nation of immigrants. So you have German immigrants. Many of them trace their ancestors coming to the United States back to the 1840s and 50s, but still feel some kinship for Germans. And at this point, remember, the US has not picked a side. It's more closely aligned with Britain, but has not picked a side and has declared itself neutral. So you have Germans who are kind of sympathetic to Germany. You have Irish, massive numbers of Irish immigrants who have no love for the British and are rooting against the British. You have a large number of Russian immigrants. They came in the second wave in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. But what you may not expect this, but Russians were actually rooting against Russia. Like, they got out for a reason, and so they had no love for their former nation. I'm generalizing here. But there were divisions among ethnic lines and country of origin. Now, there were many Americans who felt a kinship with Britain, shared language, shared history, right? That revolution was a distant memory, no need to hold a grudge over that. Americans were also divided in other ways. Labor groups, socialist groups were opposed to war, and women who universally have the right to vote yet, they will get there in 1920. Women are becoming more of a political force, and women overwhelmingly are opposed to the war. There's a popular song, and you see the poster for it, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier," which captures the anti-war sentiment in the United States. Now, that anti-war sentiment would be eroded to an extent in the ensuing years, but World War I would remain a pretty unpopular war in the United States. So let's talk about how that anti-war sentiment eroded somewhat in the ensuing years. in early 1915, Germany was being stymied on the seas by the British Navy, and they sought to break Britain's stranglehold on the seas. And so the Navy, German Navy, declares a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that individual submarine commanders could attack potentially enemy vessels at their discretion. One of those vessels that German submarines or U-boats would attack was the British steamer the Lusitania, which was sunk by torpedo on May 7th, 1915. 1,200 people on board were killed, including 159 Americans. Now, why did the Lusitania become a target? Because by this point, the United States had abandoned its neutrality and had been arming, sending supplies to Britain. So it had picked a side by this point. And the Lusitania, in fact, was carrying American arms to Great Britain. The Lusitania was 11 miles off the shore of Britain when it was attacked. A less well-known story is the presence of German saboteurs in America. A German named Franz von Rintelen came to the USA under a false name and orchestrated several bombings of merchant ships and the bombing of a munitions depot in the United States. And at this time, of course, America was supplying Germany's enemy, Great Britain. This was an attempt to undermine that support that the U.S. was providing for Great Britain. Several hundred Americans were killed. Estimated between 300 and 500 Americans were killed within the United States by these German saboteurs. Some were orchestrated by von Rintelen. Others were lone wolves. Rintelen, by the way, he was monitored. He would be monitored. His phone calls monitored. Now, the telephone, relatively new. Well, the invention wasn't from 1876, but not really widespread, the use of the phone until the early 20th century, and really until the 1920s. But his phones were monitored, telegrams were intercepted, and the feds caught wise to von Rintelen's scheming. He made his way back to Britain, but he was arrested there, extradited to the United States, where he'd spend 3 years in an Atlanta prison until he was let go after the war, and he would spend the rest of his days in England. But in addition to these coordinated efforts, there were also lone wolves. A lone wolf by the name of Erich Muntz, who was a former Harvard professor, he planted a bomb in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., just outside the Senate chamber. And that photograph there is a picture of the damage caused by the bomb. Now, the bomb went off around midnight, and the only person in the area was a guard who was injured but survived. So no one was killed in this bombing. But Muntz, after he plants the bomb, he makes his way to New York, goes to the home of American financier J.P. Morgan, and shoots Morgan because Morgan had been contributing to the British war effort. Morgan survived the assassination attempt, and Muntz took his own life. So there was this kind of internal fear. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this. It wasn't breeding massive paranoia, and still most Americans were opposed to entry into this war. That in 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election, won by one of the narrowest margins a president has ever won office. And one of the things that put him over the top was that he promised to keep America out of the First World War. That appealed to many women voters, who, as I said, did not universally have the right to vote, but individual states had approved women's suffrage by that point. Now, despite that promise, Wilson would see America enter the war as a combatant. Now, speaking of threats closer to home, in early 1917, the British intercept a message from Germany to Mexico called the Zimmermann telegram. And what the Zimmermann telegram contained was a message a message from Germany to Mexico saying that if America ever enters the war, Mexico and Germany should team up. Mexico can invade its neighbor to the north, the United States. And so this struck home for many Americans, coming on the heels of unrestricted submarine warfare, which, by the way, was back. It had ended for a time, but by this point it was back. Subversion from within to undermine Americans supplying the British. And then this telegram of a possible plot between Germany and Mexico against the United States pushed President Wilson and Congress into action. April 6, 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany, and the U.S. has entered the fray. So I started off this lesson by describing World War I as a total war. So let's talk about what that means in this context. What is total war? Well, before we look at the definition there, take a look at the poster. That's a piece of propaganda produced during World War I, saying, "Wake up, America. Lady Liberty can't sleep. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child." This poster really captures what a total war means. Every man, woman, and child, which means that everyone is being asked to contribute, even if they are not expected to pick up a weapon and run to the battlefield. The elderly, the young, men, women, all have a role to play. Because what's at stake? Well, according to this poster, civilization is at stake. So when the stakes are this high, complete commitment is required. That is, in simplest terms, what it means to be involved in a total war. Complete commitment to military victory. All other priorities are secondary. Food goes to soldiers first. Fabric for uniforms goes to soldiers before it goes to civilians. Weapons, supplies, it's all geared toward the war effort. This is mobilization on a massive scale. Every citizen expected to contribute. Think for a moment how someone might contribute to the war effort even if they can't fight. Something as simple as planting a garden, growing your own food, or not wasting food is considered one's patriotic duty because it's saving food for the troops. Serving in healthcare, many of the new offices that open up to successfully wage a war. And of course, in a war of this scale and an industrial-sized conflict, production has to step up at home, and that calls men and women. Home front production escalates, and you see images like this of women preparing munitions to send to the front lines. And this is industrialized warfare on a scale not seen before. The American Civil War, which lasted for 4 years, killed about 750,000. World War I battles would last for months and kill 1 million. So the level of deadliness reaches new heights in World War I, and it's in part because of the weapons churned out in these factories. See machine guns used in warfare on a wide scale. Artillery, heavy artillery. World War I saw the first use of a tank in combat. Those submarines that I referred to earlier. Fighter planes, Zeppelins. Now, not until World War II would warring countries really have long-range bombers that could really do damage. World War I, Germany used Zeppelins to bomb towns, bomb cities. And as these last few slides suggest, in industrialized warfare, no one is safe. So we may think of today the war on terrorism, that death could be around any corner. And you may have heard recently of a suspected terrorist attack at a mall in Munich, Germany, where no one feels safe because of a marathon, a nightclub. But during total wars, that same sense of insecurity is also rampant. Total wars embrace everyone. And that's part of the logic of industrialized warfare. If it's the people in towns and cities beyond the battlefield that are producing the bombs, the tanks, the airplanes, the bullets that are waging this war, then targeting them could weaken your enemy's war effort. And so civilians become targets. In this industrialized warfare, we see the development of deadlier and deadlier weapons, mustard gas. That's why these men are wearing gas masks, to save them from the deadly gas in the air. So that's one aspect of total war, is that it is industrialized warfare. It requires a massive number of workers at home to produce the weapons of war that then are sent to war zones where they're used to kill with deadly efficiency. Another piece of this total war picture is that government power grows. Of course, waging war on this scale is a massive, complicated undertaking. Who and what is going to coordinate all of this? Well, federal governments take on more responsibilities, take on more power. Some of the warring nations, and if you think back to the list, already were pretty authoritarian, militaristic. Russia, Germany, their governments were pretty oppressive and powerful already. But even nations with more democratic institutions, representative government, would see government powers grow by leaps and bounds, including Great Britain and including the United States. One aspect of this is greater economic controls. So in 1917, the federal government establishes the War Industries Board, which is meant to oversee production to ensure that production meets the needs of the war effort. During the war, the U.S. government takes over the railroads and has the Railroad Administration oversee railroads. Because remember, your number one priority in a total war is winning that war. So the railroads have to get those troops from point A to point B, have to get those supplies and weapons from point A to point B, because the success of that battle and the war depends on it. And there's also the War Labor Board, which is meant to avoid work stoppages, ensure peaceful negotiations between employers and labor. So the government is intervening in ways it hadn't typically. Another way that government power grows is by compulsory military service. Men registering for the selective service and entering a draft. And when their number is called, they have a choice of avoiding the draft, which is a crime, or serving. Britain had a draft, Germany had a draft, the United States had a draft. All because freedom that people take for granted, that military service in the United States is voluntary. But that expectation thrown out the window in a total war, because winning the war is priority 1 through 10. Governments, even more democratic ones, even the United States, with a tradition of free speech, free press, protected by the First Amendment, sees censorship. And not just the censorship of letters home from soldiers, but also what goes out over the airwaves. Also letters exchanged here in the United States. And much information is kept from the public because it's deemed too sensitive to know. Governments, even democratic ones, like Britain, the United States, engage in propaganda. We see a couple of examples here. There's an example of German propaganda to the your left of the screen, and to the right is American propaganda. Help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. Buy U.S. government bonds. That's another way that people can contribute to the war, is help pay for it. Pay their taxes, buy bonds, and that's what this poster is urging them to do. Some have argued that propaganda is even more important in democratic societies, because if people have freedom of mind and freedom to express themselves, then it's that much more incumbent upon the government to persuade them. Whereas in authoritarian nations, which govern more by force, intimidation, they have those avenues and don't have to change hearts and minds. In the US, the propaganda agency in charge of disseminating this information and ensuring morale and loyalty is the Committee on Public Information. The head of the CPI is the man pictured on the slide. That is George Creel, C-R-E-E-L, a former journalist. The Committee on Public Information's job was to do what I just said, to keep up morale, to explain to Americans what the stakes are, to keep them to this cause. One of the things the CPI did was that it trained so-called 4-minute men. And you see a little pamphlet there on the slide. What they did was that they trained young men to go to movie theaters, town squares, public places, and they had this 4-minute speech prepared, and they would try to, in those 4 minutes, convince people to buy war bonds to help pay for the war. Of course, they also produced posters. Propaganda usually goes in 2 different directions. It's supposed to champion the cause of that particular nation and encourage people to support the war effort. That's why we have Uncle Sam This is a World War I poster. I want you for this army. Go to the nearest recruiting station. But then you also have negative propaganda, demonizing the enemy. Take a look at that poster. Destroy this mad brute. That beastly creature there is supposed to represent Germany. You can tell by that. It's a Prussian helmet. And it's probably too small for you to see, but it says on the helmet, militarism. And there, that mad brute is carrying Lady Liberty, carrying a club, leaving behind him waste and ruin. See the destroyed buildings in the background. And if you look down by the creature's feet, it says America. So clearly the message here is that Germany is dangerous, it's brutish, and if Americans don't fight, if they listen to Uncle Sam, that brute is going to come to America's shores and brutalize Lady Liberty. So these are all part of this effort of total war. If every American is asked to commit to the effort, to contribute in some way, whether they are soldiers or not, their spirits have to be lifted. The government has to communicate the stakes, the importance of their contribution, and also put a healthy dose of fear in them, as that poster on the slide does. So we also see government powers grow in the area of surveillance. We see the surveillance state expand as they're not only looking out for spies and saboteurs like the ones that we talked about earlier, who destroyed munitions depots and merchant ships carrying supplies to the British, the man who tried to assassinate J.P. Morgan, not only on the lookout for them, but also on the lookout for people speaking out against the war. That sign there on the slide is actually a summary of a British law called the Defense of the Realm Act, which actually outlawed anti-government, anti-war speech in Great Britain during World War I. The United States did the same thing. Even in a nation with the First Amendment, which we've talked about quite a bit. Free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition were severely curtailed in World War I. The Espionage and Sedition Acts. To clarify what that means, the Espionage Act was the initial act passed in 1917. The Espionage Act was amended a few times, and that's what the Sedition Acts are. I picked out just a piece of the Espionage Act. You're actually, in your discussion, you're going to look at the decision of a Supreme Court case which actually upheld the Espionage Act. So the Espionage Act is still on the books. In fact, the current administration, President Obama's administration, has used the Espionage Act more than any president since World War I, since Woodrow Wilson, using it to attempt to punish leakers in the government. If Edward Snowden were in the United States, rest assured it would be used against him. Let's take a look at this excerpt from the Espionage Act. When the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements. This is describing the people who will be punished. Shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote the success of its enemies, and whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the U.S. to the injury of the service or of the U.S., shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000 or imprisonment for not more than 20 years or both. So if I could sum this up, it means that anyone considered to be interfering with the war effort in any way, even with their speech, can face steep punishments. $10,000 fine, 20 years in prison. More than 2,000 people were charged under the Espionage Act between 1917 and 1918. 1918, the war ends. The U.S. is only at war for about a year. One man was put on trial for causing President Wilson, quote, a Wall Street tool. He was put on trial. Now, he was acquitted. The judge dismissed those charges. Not everyone was so lucky. Eugene Debs, pictured there, in both the cartoon and the photograph, he was a socialist. He had actually run for president in 1912. Received almost 1 million votes. He gave an anti-war speech in Ohio. He was arrested, sentenced to 20 years in prison for making a speech. Undeterred, in 1920, Debs would run for president from prison and lose. Debs would later be pardoned, and he would not serve out his 20-year term. He would be pardoned later on. But this shows that those rights in the Bill of Rights continue to be contested, never considered absolute. Others would be targeted. Emma Goldman, she was one of the founders of a group called the No Conscription League, meaning she opposed the draft. She and others from that group, well, the group's offices were raided, so they had been monitored by law enforcement. Their offices were raided. Goldman and others arrested. And she was convicted. And after the war, she was deported back to Russia. Another individual who would be punished under the Espionage Act is Charles Schenck, who is pictured there. He was arrested handing out pamphlets at a draft station, encouraging people to oppose the draft. Now, it seems as if Schenck knew he would be arrested, and it was his intent to challenge the Espionage Act in the courts. Schenck, like Debs, was a socialist. And you see that is one of the pamphlets there on the slide that he was handing out along the Constitution of the United States. Wake up, America, your liberties are in danger. So the fact that he is opposing the Espionage Act and handing this out at a draft station made him a clear target for enforcers of the Espionage Act. And he would be arrested, and his case would go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And you'll actually read the decision for discussion, and that'll be part of our discussion later in the week. Now, Schenck and Goldman, Debs were not the only ones who opposed the Espionage Act. Here's a group of protesters on Thanksgiving outside the White House, trying to remind President Wilson, remember the Constitution. There can be no real Thanksgiving for Americans who are in jail for their belief in free speech. As you see that cartoon there, the espionage bill has taken the light away from the Statue of Liberty. So these measures, these steps taken by the federal government were contested, were unpopular, and were protested, even though these protesters faced the risk of fines or imprisonment. So America was very much divided. It remained divided through the brief time that America was at war. I talked earlier about how American neutrality rested on the fact that Americans were very much divided about entering the war at all. Once America enters the war, more Americans, of course, are supportive of the government and the effort. But that does not mean that Americans are united. So in addition to the fear of subversion, there's a fear of people from outside, specifically immigrants. During the war, Congress passes over President Wilson's veto. The president vetoes this Immigration Act of 1917, but Congress has enough of a majority to pass over the president's veto. Here's what the Immigration Act of 1917 did. It bars immigrants from entering the United States who are over 16 and do not have a basic literacy. It bars so-called undesirables from entering the country, and it is a long list. It includes people with health problems like, quote, epileptics. Prostitutes are on the list, people who have destroyed property in their country of origin, people who have expressed radical beliefs in their country of origin. It creates a very long list of people who are no longer welcome in the U.S. It also creates the so-called Asiatic Barred Zone, which pretty much bans all immigration from Asia. There had already been a Chinese Exclusion Act a couple decades earlier. Essentially bars all immigration from Asia, except for the Philippines, which was a U.S. territory. Now, there were two things motivating this Immigration Act. One was a fear of so-called undesirables, dissidents, radicals entering the country, undermining the war effort, undermining America. But there's also racism at the heart of this. As you see, of course, the Asiatic Barred Zone, but many of these undesirables, those who would be deemed undesirable, came from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, where this second wave was coming from. And so these new powers of government, these efforts to label different people, to distinguish one group from another, would be abused. The U.S. Justice Department deputized some 250,000 Americans as part of its so-called American Protective League Secret Service. In other words, these were not government employees. It's almost like you getting a Boy Scout badge or a badge in a box of cereal. Their job was to spy on neighbors, spy on co-workers, keep their eye on suspicious characters of any type, and report them. This is the World War I version of if you see something, say something. So they're kind of in a quasi-official capacity. This American Protective League morphed into a law-breaking vigilante group. They bugged people's phones and offices. They broke into people's homes and offices and burglarized them. They slandered people in public, accusing them of crimes, of sedition. They illegally arrested people. They illegally opened people's mail. So repression trickled down from the federal government to states, to state governments, to local governments, and even ordinary people. Suspected radicals, German sympathizers were harassed. People were harassed simply for being German. Men accosted other men on the streets and asked them to show their draft cards. One in Montana lynched a labor organizer. Germans specifically were targeted. The teaching of German was banned in schools throughout the country. German businesses were targeted, shut down. It was during World War I that the Frankfurter became the hot dog, because Frankfurter was too German sounding. It's also during World War I that the hamburger was called the Liberty Sandwich, and sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage. No German sounding words. Only one of those has caught on, as I'm sure you know. So the war created, in a sense, a kind of hysteria, anti-German sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment. And the government, particularly law enforcement, would take a major initiative to try to suppress any dissent of any kind, raising a debate about civil liberties, individual freedoms, and the Bill of Rights. From the government's point of view, the war effort was so overwhelming, it was the top priority. And even the Constitution should play second fiddle to it. The war does come to an end. November 11th, 1918, Germany finally surrenders. A 4-year-long war in Europe, and also it spread to other parts of the world. There was fighting in Africa, there's fighting in Asia. Remember, Japan was one of the combatants. Some 16 million people died in World War I. About 9 million of those were on the battlefield. About 7 million were non-combatants, showing the reach of total war. Though American involvement was short-lived, America's involvement would still have significant impact on the home front. There's another consequence of the First World War I want to highlight, and this is important in the American side of the history as well. Is that this was a war, World War I, that toppled empires. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire no longer exists. Austria-Hungary no longer exists. They're broken up by treaty. World War I would also see the demise of another empire, the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire ended by revolution and civil war. A succession of revolutions occurred between 1917 and 1921 that would topple the Tsar, the dynasty, and upend the political system in Russia, but also refashion its relationship with the rest of the world. One of the reasons why revolution broke out in Russia is because Russia was suffering mightily during the war, suffering losses on the battlefield and also deprivation at home. The price of basic necessities like bread was skyrocketing. And actually the Russian Revolution began with women marching through the streets, calling for bread and an end to the war. Within a week of those bread riots, the Tsar had abdicated. The ruler of Russia had left his throne provisional government takes its place, that provisional government would come under duress and assault by communists. So when the dust settles, a series of revolutions and a civil war in Russia, when the dust settles, a new nation emerges. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR, or the Soviet Union. It's the first communist state in the world. So why is this significant in relation to the United States? Well, we're probably more familiar with the Red Scare after World War II, McCarthyism and red baiting in the 1950s. Well, there's actually an earlier Red Scare in the late 19-teens, early 1920s. Fear of communists, socialists, labor unions, and anarchists. In 1919, the year after World War I ends, there's a succession of strikes nationwide. And they're not coordinated. It's not like a nationwide conspiracy, though some interpret it as such. Where dock workers in Seattle, truck drivers in Minneapolis, police in Boston. There was a police strike in Boston in 1919, and that's what that photograph on the slide is. Picture of police striking, taken to the streets in 1919. So there are these waves of work stoppages throughout the country, labor activism. Some interpret this wave of strikes as the beginnings of a Russian-style revolution in the United States. Is this communism coming to America's shores? Will this radicalism take hold, upend capitalism, and overthrow the American government? This cartoon captures that fear. You see labor starting, first step, strikes and walkouts. Next, disorder and riots. Bolshevism, that's Russian communism. Bolshevism and murders, chaos, and then what next? So there's this perception that this labor uprising was part of a kind of global conspiracy leading to revolution. Now that's a serious exaggeration of the reality, but some of those fears were legitimate. In 1919, a series of mysterious packages were sent to prominent Americans, including the man pictured there, the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The Attorney General is the head of the Justice Department, the chief law enforcement agency associated with the federal government. Well, in those mysterious packages were bombs. A bomb was sent to Palmer's house. It detonated. No, he was unharmed. No one was killed in the detonation. But this set off a new wave of fears and a crackdown, led by Palmer himself. These become known as the Palmer Raids. And in these raids, some 5,000 people are arrested, most of them without warrants. So we've talked quite a bit about the First Amendment questions that are rising in World War I and its immediate aftermath. Here there's also a Fourth Amendment question. What are people being charged with? What is the probable cause here? Hundreds of people are deported, sent out of the United States in these Palmer raids. Now, the public sentiment toward Palmer and President Woodrow Wilson is one of anger. And not just of the groups targeted. Not just of the groups targeted. You see on the slide here that photograph depicts the offices of a group called the International Workers of the World, or IWW. This was a labor union founded in Chicago back in 1908 that was committed to ending capitalism. As you see, their offices were raided, several of their members were arrested, and the IWW would essentially cease to be in the wake of the Palmer raids. And that's one of the effects, is that we see labor would stagnate under this intimidation in the years to follow. Radical groups would be decimated in the years to follow. Among those people deported were Emma Goldman. We saw in an earlier slide, and you'll actually read a speech of hers when she was on trial during the war for a violation of the Espionage Act. Well, while these raids are taking place, a deadly bombing occurs on Wall Street. September 16th, 1920. Bombs explode on Wall Street in New York City, killing 30 people. Now, it's never been discovered who planted these bombs. No one took responsibility for them. This further sowed fears of possible revolution in the United States, anarchism, trying to undo the American way, the American system. What's peculiar about this bombing is that it didn't sway American opinion to support Palmer and his raids. In fact, Palmer was a highly unpopular figure. Woodrow Wilson's popularity would, such as it was, would plummet, as the perception was that the government was taking too much power, abusing civil liberties to an unacceptable extent, even in the context of fears, which we see in retrospect were indeed exaggerated. But those fears would also take shape in other ways, and we would see continuation of immigration restriction. So the Immigration Act of 1924 would build on the restrictions put in place with that earlier Immigration Act of 1917. That earlier act was concerned, as we saw, with potential subversives, radicals coming into the country. But it was also at its heart a racist law as well. So was the Immigration Act of 1924. Here's what that did. Limits immigration to the United States to 150,000 a year total. Total of 150,000 a year are allowed to come into the U.S. It's capped. But it does not let everyone in. It sets quotas based on an immigrant's country of origin. Now, each country was assigned a different quota. How is that quota determined? Well, it set the quota based on 2% of their number in the U.S. in 1890. So that means that it favored, this Immigration Act favored immigrants from Britain, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavian countries like Norway. Because it wasn't until 1890 that the second wave of immigration really accelerates. Immigrants from Italy, from Russia, from Poland, from Bulgaria, from Greece. This was meant to limit immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, because those people were considered troublesome, carriers of disease, carriers of dangerous ideas like anarchism and socialism, and also considered racially inferior. Furthermore, this act bars any immigrant ineligible for citizenship. This essentially puts an end to any immigration from Asia. Because by those earlier acts, Asians were people from Japan, people from China, Korea were ineligible for citizenship. This shuts the door to them. So we see America being closed off and suspicious of one another, and particularly of those who look different, who sound different, who think different, and come from different places. And so we see the same kind of racialized thinking that builds the Jim Crow South also being applied to people from abroad. And so when there is a surveillance state, there is the danger of marginalized groups being targeted to an extent that is not equal to the threat they actually pose. We saw this in a different way during the witch trials. People who kind of lived on the margins, who didn't conform, suspected of witchcraft. Here we see people with different political ideas, different skin colors, speaking different languages, automatically come under suspicion. And there are several ways that governments and other groups attempt to deal with them. Kick them out, bar them from entering, arrest them, fine them, monitor them, surveil them, intimidate them so that they conform to that model or get out.